Thank you. And thank you, Eli, for inviting me. I've just been back in town for 10 days, and we were living in Germany for 2 years, and I was working for the UN. And I was walking down here today, down Canby Street all the way down, and I was doing this thing, which I just realized was totally wrong, but I was making eye contact with every person on the street. Because if you've ever been or lived in Germany, they are a super eye contact-y culture, right? My theory is that it's like from East-West Germany, the Stasi, right? Culture of secrecy, now you are seen, right? Every person on the street sees you, right? And I was just walking down the street being like, yeah, hey, how's it going? And it was just super awkward, so I need to get over that practice, so I'm sorry if there's been too much eye contact today from me already. So Capulet, super briefly, we describe ourselves these days as a marketing and invention agency. We invent new ways for organizations to achieve their marketing ambitions. And we say we work with nonprofits and charities and companies that care, right? So we've worked with Mountain Equipment Co-op and Greenpeace and most recently the United Nations. So before November 30th, which was the first day of the climate talks in Paris, I had never interrupted a head of state. Right? In fact, if you don't count yelling at the television, I'd actually never spoken to a head of state at all. But yet here I was in the corner of a room, kind of bigger than this, but kind of similar, and I was like standing over here in the corner, just contemplating that very thing. I was about to interrupt a national leader, a head of state. So I'm going to back up a bit and tell you the story of how that happened. As was mentioned, I've been working 2 years for the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat, or formerly known as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But today we're just going to call it the Secretariat. And if you don't know the Secretariat, you can think of them as the butler to the world on climate change, okay? And they do a lot of stuff, but their main core activity is to organize meetings for climate change negotiations. And each year they organize a kind of Lollapalooza of climate change, which is that like maybe Glastonbury now? I don't go to music festivals. Anyway, they organize a major conference every December in different places around the world called the Conference of the Parties. And we've had 21 of them, so the most recent one was called COP21. So I'll call it COP21 the rest of the day. Little side note, why is it called Conference of the Parties and not Conference of the Countries? There is an obviously problematic acronym. But other than that, there is the problem that Europe negotiates as one party, actually, apparently. And so then we had to call everybody parties, not countries. Anyway, so COP21. I've been to 2 COPs now. I went to COP20 in Lima, and then I went to COP21 in Paris. Now, COP21, as some of you, if you work in the environmental or climate movement, you know some of this, so just consider this remedial for the rest of you. COP21 is like the quarter quell of climate change conferences because the world was negotiating a sequel to the Kyoto Protocol. And for a number of other reasons, the eyes of the world were kind of on Paris for those 2 weeks. And so it was a big style event, right? It was 50,000 attendees, 3,500 journalists in 40 acres near Charles de Gaulle Airport outside of Paris. And on the first day of the conference, November 30th, a Monday, we had the greatest gathering of world leaders ever in one place. We had 150 world leaders come. Here you can see President Obama meeting with the head of the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, and then there's the President of France looking kind of sheepish in the background there. But this is how the day actually started that day. These 2 guys and my boss, Christiana Figueres, the head of the Secretariat, they stood out there outside in the kind of chilly December French weather for like 4 hours while motorcade after motorcade drove up, dropping off world leaders. Shake hands, shake, 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 photo opportunity, and inside. And so it was just like Argentina, Armenia, Aruba, Australia, Austria, just on and on like that, all throughout the morning. And so the leaders came in and this is like, to me, the weird thing is they sat in this room. This was called the VVIP room, the very, very important persons. We love acronyms at the UN, and this is what they called it. And it just looks like kind of shabby, doesn't it, for like 150 world leaders. Anyway, they had meetings, and they had what we call bilaterals or side meetings, and they went for lunch, and then they took a group photo. Here we can see a little footage of them schmoozing right before the group photo. And then in the afternoon in the main plenary hall, each world leader was invited to speak for 3 minutes, right? How many world leaders do you think actually just used the 3 minutes, right? And to my personal shame, Justin Trudeau took 8 minutes in his 3-minute talk. So that was a little distressing. And so then also throughout the day, about a couple dozen world leaders would come to the media room, and they would have a press conference, and the national media of that country would come in, and NGOs and supporters in some cases. And the leader would take questions and make a statement and so forth. And so I had many jobs over the 2 weeks, but somebody got sick. And so this particular day, my responsibility was wrangling the media room, right? Making sure the right parties came at the right time, the right media were in the room, yada, yada. And, I had it going really well. I had it going like Eli for most of the day here, right? Like it was Spain, it was Sweden, it was South Korea, boom, boom, boom. It was fine, and it was a tight schedule, like each group had a half hour, until this fella came along. This man, if you may not know him, he's the president of Bolivia. He's Evo Morales. And he's like famously grouchy and loquacious, right? Like really long-winded. And so he came and he started talking, and he gave a long statement in Spanish. And I didn't have my simultaneous translation headphones at the moment, but long statement, and started taking questions from the media. There were a lot of media there for him because he's a real advocate on climate change. He is a real hero, actually, as well. But he took questions and questions, and then it was 5 minutes toward the next group, which were the Italians. And by the way, it was the greatest day of stereotyping in my life, because each day I'd have to look, oh, are you Ecuadorian? You'd have to look across the room. Is that person Norwegian or Swedish? Because you had to identify the next party as they came in to make sure. Anyway, so he's talking. The Italians are kind of waiting in the wings, and there's 5 minutes left. And so I go to his aide, who was off to the side, and he's classically for South America, he's a military officer in his full dress uniform with just a chest full of medals. And I'm like, okay, you got 5 minutes, to his aide. And he nods. I don't think he speaks any English, and I don't speak any Spanish. But anyway, he nods, and we carry on. And he just keeps talking, keeps taking questions. 5 minutes pass, 10 minutes pass. The Italians are tapping their stylish watches, going, Just my luck, Italians are on time for once, right? But, so I go back to the aide, and the aide is clearly terrified of his president. And this is, first, like I said, somebody got sick, and so I don't know the protocol here. I don't know what you're supposed to do when a head of state is going on too long. And so I just waited there and waited, and finally I just kind of winced. He was about to take another question. I just went up and said, "I'm sorry, sir, we need to wrap it up." And he was like, I was like, "Oh," and he was like, "All right," and he just got up and left. And it was amazingly easy. I was shocked. But he's just a guy, right? It just turns out he's just a guy. So this talk has a number of lessons in it. And this is the first one. If you ever encounter this, hopefully, if we're lucky, none of us will ever encounter this problem, myself in particular. But that's the first lesson. Be polite but firm when interrupting a head of state. And so the conference is 2 weeks, right? And we, as the Secretariat, we had planned this set of events. So there's the main negotiations that happen, but there's an immense number of side events. It's kind of like South by Southwest, if there was just one main negotiation at South by Southwest, and then everything else that happens at South by Southwest. And so we had planned this series of events over the 10 days, kind of early in the conference, called, it's just such a terrible, international development name, the Lima to Paris Action Agenda, right? And these were a series of side events, as we call them, which had lots of famous people in them, right? Here we have Al Gore speaking, but they had lots of CEOs, lots of regional mayors. Our own mayor, Gregor Robertson, was speaking at some things. And, there were days on forests and buildings and renewable energy and so forth. And then we had a big action day on the Saturday. And we had all sorts of people there. Sean Penn there gave the most desultory speech you'll ever hear a celebrity give. Al Gore, it was great a number of times, the head of Alibaba and so forth. And so, we had this 10 days of this Lima Paris Action Agreement, which was connected to the negotiations, but not essential to them. But part of our job there is to celebrate climate action, particularly climate action by what we call subnational governments and the private sector, right? And so that was the execution of that. But there was a kind of stealth plan, or as I understand it, a kind of stealth plan to running that Lima Paris Action Agreement, I think, which has a valuable lesson in it. And this was that it acted as a weapon of mass distraction for the media, right? Because as I said, 3,500 media are there. Many of them are not climate reporters. Many of them are not even environmental reporters. And so they don't necessarily know what to report on. In the first week of the negotiations, it's not sexy or interesting. So this was kind of this opportunity to tell a bunch of positive stories about climate change from all different levels of government all over the world and feed something like shiny and useful and compelling to the media to kind of distract them from the boring old negotiations until those negotiations really heated up in the final days. And so this was a really successful strategy. There was a lot of positive stories that came out of the climate talks as a result of this LPAA system. And so my lesson here is, always make something for the media. Always consider that game plan. And, I'm by no means taking credit for this. This is great media strategy by a number of my colleagues there. But it was really, really an effective strategy. So, as I mentioned, we love our acronyms at the UN, right? I could just go on, SDM, CDM, INDC, CER, it's just on and on. Like the first couple of months there was just like, I had to make a dictionary of acronyms to learn them. And somebody mentioned ACON, and I was like, oh, that's an acronym I haven't heard of before. But it turns out he's actually a hip hop artist, not an acronym at all. There he is. He was one of the luminaries at the event. And he runs something called ACON Lighting Africa. It's one of the many solar lighting projects for the developing world, very worthwhile cause. And I tell this story, and I mention ACON because we got connected to him, meaning we, when I say we in this context, I'm talking about the communications and outreach team from the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat. We got connected to him, and we made him one of the first victims, I would say, of something called the Twitter Mirror. And the Twitter Mirror is something produced by Twitter that they give to major global events as kind of their events, part of their event strategy, part of their real-time event strategy. And you can see it here on the right. It's kind of this 3D printed frame with an iPad mini in the middle of it. And ours was all black, so it's kind of goth. The one on the right is not so goth, but it's got a very basic, simple kind of app in it. And the idea is you get celebrities, you get leaders. We also got the Prime Minister of India, for example, to take a selfie with this mirror, kind of like that, or record a very short video. And there's like tools in it. They can sign their name or annotate their selfie or whatever. And it's kind of interesting shtick. It makes the luminary or celebrity feel special. It's a really simple, short ask for digital channels, right? That you can grab somebody just as they're coming off stage or just as they're going on stage. And it takes them like, 15 or 30 seconds. We really wanted videos, so we asked most people to record a video. And I will say that nobody got it right the first time, right? They had to do 2 or 3 takes, except for my boss, Christiana Figueres, who was just like, if you've ever met her or seen her speak, she is a force of nature. And we briefed her on it, and it was toward the end of the talk, so she was working so hard. But she just took a moment in the way she does, and then crushed it in one take, and it was amazing. And in any case, you'll see where I'm coming to on this lesson, but I wanted to show you this. This is actually our 4th most popular tweet for the 2 weeks of the Climate Change Secretariat. We tweeted over 800 times from our various accounts in that time. And so this is the result of that we were seeing in the previous shot, that setup of ACON and the Twitter Mirror. So this is just a 15-second video, so we might as well watch it here. Hopefully this will work.
Hey, what's going on, world? It's your boy ACON, founder of ACON Lighting Africa, here to spread a nice little message to you about climate change. It's very important for us to do our search on it and understand that it's something that will affect our future. More than anything, our kids' future. So let's live a real clean, green future. All right, peace.
Peace, yeah. So that was really cool. And the background, the actual lesson I need to pivot to here, if you're wondering why I was talking about a hip-hop star and a Twitter mirror, is that partnerships really matter. Even at the UN level, right, that we had these informal relationships with different staff at UN headquarters and other agencies. We had fostered this relationship with Twitter France in this case, and with Twitter Music, that arm of Twitter, to make all of this happen. And then because we had those relationships, we got them to retweet it, retweet ACON's message there. And so between the UN headquarters, between Twitter Music, and ACON himself, that was like 20 million followers that it was retweeted to. And you might have the sense that the Climate Change Secretariat is like omnipowerful with the communications marketing and digital channels, but not really. When I joined, I think they had less than 100,000 Twitter followers, which for an international agency is not that many, right? The UN headquarters has almost 6 million now. So these partnerships, both the formal ones, and you can imagine at the UN they're very formal, and the very informal, lower level relationships you make with other digital staff and so forth are really critical to being successful. So along with the talks, along with all the side events, there's like a kind of Expo 86 that happens at the climate the conference as well, right? Different countries, different companies, different orgs, all have pavilions or exhibition booths there, right? This is the slightly pushy robot from the Chinese pavilion who would kind of follow you around to talk about climate change. It was a little aggressive. This is the India pavilion that actually featured a water feature, like it had a water, like a fountain there, and very good snacks at the India pavilion. You care about these things when you're living in an airport hotel for 3 weeks. But and this is a photo I took of the France pavilion just before we opened, and you can make it out right here. This is the edge of the wine bar in the France pavilion, which is not surprising. So, everybody spent a lot of money, right? Or a lot of countries spent a lot of money on these pavilions. It was pretty fancy, right? But what made the most what made the most noise, what got the most attention, and was the background of like 1,000 selfies, was this. Aurora, the Greenpeace polar bear. So this is a giant animatronic polar bear about the size of a double-decker bus, built out of recycled materials by Greenpeace. And her name's Aurora, and she kind of sat at the entrance to the COP and would roar occasionally. She opens her mouth and roars, right? And she got a ton of attention and got a lot of media play, and they had events in front of it. And so I think, in our work at Capulet, we do a lot of work on, as I say, marketing invention. We talk about building remarkables, right? Remarkables are like campaigns and platforms and gimmicks which are worthy of being remarked upon, worthy of being shared, right? Which reach new audiences, which energize your base or energizing your existing audience. And you might think that those like pavilions were remarkables, but they were not. Aurora was a remarkable, right? Because of just what she was and the way she looked and how you came into the COP, into this very formal setting with everyone in suits, most everyone in suits, and you looked over and there was a giant polar bear there roaring at you at the door. And so she did launch 1,000 selfies, as you can see there. I have another remarkable that's considerably less cool than Aurora, but we're proud of it still. This is something we launched at COP20 in Lima as kind of version 1, and then we made changes and launched and rolled it out version 2 in Paris. It's called Climate Talks Live. You can see it right now at climatetalkslive.org, right? And I would describe it as a public-facing social listening tool. And when we're doing ideation and developing ideas for remarkables, one thing we always consider is like, oh, what if we changed the scale of something by 1,000, right? Or what if we took something and totally flipped it on its head? And this is the latter case here, where social listening typically is like generates business intelligence for companies and organizations. It's like proprietary information that they can use to generate more funds or to sell more widgets to you. But in this case, we made a public social listening tool. And this used the Twitter fire hose and captured millions of tweets over the 2-week period of the COP. Millions of tweets in year 2, less so in Lima, because it was less of a big deal. And then it visualized those stats in a number of kind of interesting ways. And I don't want to take time to show it to you in detail here, but you can check it out. But it was quite effective for a number of reasons. One, you're always, and Jason alluded to this earlier, I think, you're always kind of waging a battle when you're coming from the digital side to emphasize the importance of digital. And as you might imagine, in the UN negotiation system, where they actually, this is not a word of a lie, there's a booth called documents, right? And when a new draft of the agreement would come out, there'd just be like a horde of like 500 people from all over the world just waiting to get their printed copy of the new draft of the agreement, right? So it's very paper-based, very legal world. So one of the reasons we built this, not only was it cool, and it provided this opportunity to show what just the attendees of the COP were tweeting about compared to the whole world, right? God bless the interns who had to go through and find every Twitter account for every attendee at the COP. That was, yeah, it was a thankless job, I'm afraid. But you could just get a view of like just what the media at the COP are talking about, or just what negotiators are talking about, or what the whole world is talking about, and compare those views. But also, we produced 3 versions of it. A desktop version, a mobile version, and this large screen version. And this version was a kind of propaganda to the negotiators of the COP and other agencies to be like, look, digital matters, this conversation's happening in real time, check it out, right? And this was had a kind of slideshow view that would show different, like who's trending right now. And one unintended consequence of this is there was also this stream view, which just showed in near real time kind of what the top trending tweets were in the last hour. And that was actually super useful to our team and to the kind of crisis communications people on our team to understand what was getting talked about in real time. And we heard from lots of other agencies in the media that this was a great view, a kind of perspective to monitor what was happening in like near real time, just in kind of the last hour. And I can tell a lot of stories about the back end on this and how it was built and how it was effective and managing blacklists and whitelists and that sort of thing. But it was a real success, and it was just one of those, it's become a new platform that the UN's going to use going forward, I think. And so, I've said this already, but the lesson here is make something worthy of being remarked upon, right? Make an Aurora, make a Climate Talks Live. What is the thing you can make that is going to attract a lot of attention? And the next question here is always, but those are expensive. My latest example of the cheap remarkable is Cape Breton if Trump wins, which some of you in the room may have seen. Radio DJ in Cape Breton launched this website promoting Cape Breton, which is slowly losing population, I guess. They're inviting Americans to come to Cape Breton if Trump wins. He built it for an $8 a month Squarespace site and some nice photos, right? And it got 800,000 views, global media coverage, and President Obama mentioned it recently, actually, in a press conference. So, that's a good result for your 1 day of work and your $8 Squarespace site. So, I want to talk a little bit about NGOs and their role at the COP or other major international events like this. Some of you may have seen this, which was in the Place de la République in Paris, right, where people started putting their shoes out. And it was organized, I think, by a vase, and it became this really powerful monument, both to the Paris attacks that had happened just a couple weeks earlier, and to mourning the loss of the People's Climate March, which was called off because of security concerns about the attacks, right? So this is kind of a march in absence, or a ghost march, by people putting shoes here. And Ban Ki-moon, the head of the Secretary General of the UN, and the Pope himself dropped by and put their shoes down as well, right? So, I've worked in climate change a lot over the past decade, and it's, you may disagree, but I find it's difficult to find the emotional hooks compared to a lot of other causes, right? It's difficult to find those stories that aren't just polar bears on an ice floe. But this was just like a really powerful emotional moment, right? However, there were a lot of actions, protests around Paris and inside the venue, because there were thousands of NGOs as part of the attendees at the event. These are some people, I forget the particulars of why they're lying down in front of the temporary Eiffel Tower. That's not part of the action, that was just there as a kind of public art. And then these people held this red fabric to indicate a red line that we couldn't cross with regards to the temperature rise and this sort of thing. And while these were, kind of newsworthy, and this may be a slightly unpopular thing, but I think if you're an NGO going to one of these events, this is like the least important thing you can do, right? I have some view into the strategy behind this, but like the actual work of pressuring leaders happens long before the COP, right? Happens months and years before the COP. And so what I saw the smart NGOs doing at the COP and talking to them and observing them is these are the things they were doing. Like I said, there was a ton of media demand, 3,500 journalists just all sitting around waiting for news, right? So it was a great opportunity to make connections with your local or national media and develop them, provide yourself as a source or develop stories with them, right? It was a great time to build and foster and deepen alliances with like-minded groups, because kind of everybody is coming to the circus from all sides. And so you could meet people from other parts of the world and conduct meetings and build alliances and coalitions in that context, right? It's an emotional, high-stakes environment. And so I think it's a great time for staff bonding too. That does seem a little weird, but it's like, hey, we're all going to the craziest summer camp ever in Paris, and so let's all have this experience together. And then it can be inspiring to supporters. Like, you know, I think these sorts of protests appear to the supporters powerful, even if they, I don't think, have any impact at all on the people who are present in the space at the COP. So I think it can still be useful to run these. I'm not saying you shouldn't necessarily do them, but I do think they're a lower priority. So I think the overall lesson about NGOs coming to a COP or coming to another similar kind of super big event is make a game plan, have a game plan in advance, and stick to it. I wanted to give you a little view, a little peek behind the scenes. You know, there's some numbers I can share, some numbers I can't share, but into just how busy and kind of amplified a time it was for the UN during the climate talks, right? So the website assets, we have a number of sites, got roughly 6 times the normal amount of traffic, got 10 times the amount of reach on Twitter, 18 times the amount on Facebook, right? So it was a really big deal for the Secretariat, and there was a really, it was, as you might imagine, a very intense time working on the comms team there. I thought it was an interesting chart. This shows the overall web traffic to the UN sites. The blue is COP21, right? The red is COP20 in Lima, and the green is Copenhagen, right, which is like kind of the last big COP in green. And you can see that there was an enormous spike in interest throughout, but particularly the first day and the last day. This is the communications team. And so, you know, the kind of last story I want to tell you is about the final days of the negotiations. And so, you know, like I mentioned, we had all these side events planned and all these activities and these stunts and a ton of stuff to cover. And then eventually, especially, you know, like the, I don't know, NHL labor negotiations and every other major negotiation, things go into overtime. And you run out of other stuff to communicate about. So you're kind of sitting around, quite tired, just waiting for the decision, right? And we felt confident that an agreement was going to be reached, but not 100% confident. My colleague, who is a speechwriter, to his credit, he did not write the other speech, right? I said, oh, have you written like the concession speech? And he's like, no, I've just written the one speech. And so, you know, we had a lot of hours of sitting around while the negotiators negotiated all night, sleeping when they can like that. And fundamentally, it came down to we just had one more question. That was the only question we had to answer, which is like, when the agreement is announced, what should the tweet be, right? Like, because we had like 8 hours of kind of not a lot else to do at the end, where we were just like, oh, you know, when is this going to happen, and what should we do? And so, you know, we did this thing that a lot of you in the room will probably be familiar with. It originally arose at The Onion, and then Upworthy does this too, which is write 25 headlines, right? If you're writing a story, write 25 headlines for that story, because the first or the third is not the best. It turns out the 17th is probably the best. And that's harder than it sounds. And so we wrote like more than 25 different tweets, knocked them around, and you know, there's no like, I could stand up here and like pretend to have all the science behind what would be the perfect tweet, but I don't. And so, you know, we tried a lot of things, and we finally ended up with this. That was the tweet shot that, you know, heard around the world. 7 billion people, 195 countries, one Paris Agreement toward a better future for all. #COP21. And then this picture of, you know, different individuals, not all famous people, but all sorts of different people who were at the event, this little web postcard. And this tweet was the most popular tweet we'd ever tweeted, right? Got retweeted almost 2,000 times. You know, to this day, I wonder, wow, could we have done something differently and gotten 10 or 20,000 retweets, right? Or was this as good as it gets? And I don't really have a lot of ingenious insights into why this worked or how well it worked. Like I said, it's our best tweet ever, but you kind of expect that at the announcement of a major agreement that we would do pretty well. Interestingly, we did another tweet 15 minutes later, which actually linked to the agreement text, like it actually linked to our website, and it did almost exactly the same in terms of visibility and reach, right? This is a slightly drier tweet, I would say, but nonetheless, as you might imagine, champagne was popped, champagne was cracked, and we were all, you know, pretty delighted at the end there. And so working in the progressive space, environmental space for a long time, maybe you don't need to hear this lesson, but I do think sometimes we fail to adequately celebrate successes, both internally and externally, right? So I think a lesson of like taking the time and celebrating successes, I think is hopefully something useful to hear. It's also important to stay humble, right? Because as you may recall, during the climate talks on December 7th, Kim Kardashian had her second baby, Saint West. And she announced it with 4 emojis, and she got 105,000 retweets. So context, so we thought we hit it out of the park, but Ms. Kardashian West definitely hit it further out of the park. What are you gonna do? So this last photo, this is a photo of me, just of my hand, just walking out of the COP. It's very late on the last day with I stopped at the document stand and got my printed copy of the Paris Agreement. And we were, really relieved that a deal had been reached. Whether or not you think that deal is brilliant or okay or terrible, we can talk about that later. I did like a way, I'm so sorry, I've forgotten who said this, but it's the way I talk to people outside of the climate space about the deal. I say, and I'm borrowing this from someone, they said, the world has bought their gym membership, and now we need to go 4 times a week, right? And so I think that's a useful way to frame it. But my last lesson is this, is that, we managed to get over the finish line and get it done, and so you can have faith too that you will with the projects and goals you're working on. So I think we have a little time for questions, about 8 minutes, so thank you very much for listening.